In this nugget, our objective is simple. I want to walk through the basic concepts of how DNS works and why it's so useful. And then secondly, I'd like to introduce you to our lab environment, how you can get hands-on practice to reinforce all the skills that we're learning in this course. Let's begin. When a user like you or I wants to actually go out on the internet or reach some service, we're normally using a name of some type, like www.cbtnuggets.com or similar. But the challenge is, behind the scenes, we're actually reaching out and connecting to devices based on IP addresses, which could be IP version 4 or IP version 6. But in either case, humans, we use these friendly names, and the networks are using IP addresses and a bunch of numbers as part of those addresses. So the solution to that problem is to have some type of a system that will resolve a name like cbtnuggets.com to an appropriate IP address so that our computer can then build and establish connections to those servers at those IP addresses. So here's the play-by-play. Let's imagine that we have Bob's computer right here, and Bob is going to go out to, for our example, let's say www.acme.com. And Bob could be using a browser, or he might have a command line utility trying to connect to the web server represented by www.acme.com. When Bob makes that request on the application that he's currently using on his local PC, Bob's computer is going to do a couple of things when Bob tries to reach acme.com. Number one, the computer is going to say, well, is it already in the cache? Meaning, have I already resolved that to some IP address previously, and is it in memory at this moment? Another option that Bob's computer has is to reference a text file called the hosts file. And with a host file that's configured on Bob's computer, that's another way that Bob's local computer can try to resolve or figure out what the actual IP address is behind a name. Now, if those methods don't work out, Bob's machine could also use DNS, the domain name system, and make a request. Now, Bob's computer is very likely been trained, either dynamically or statically configured, to use a DNS server. And that DNS server, that domain name system server, could be out on the internet. For example, 8888 is an IPv4 address that represents a boatload of DNS servers provided by Google. Or if the service provider providing internet connectivity is providing the DNS services, there could be an IP address provided by the service provider to reach the internet service provider's DNS. However, another option is we could have our own internal DNS server on our own internal network. And that's where Windows Server 2016 could come in. We could install the DNS server role on an internal server. So if we played this out, if Bob needed to resolve a name to an IP address like acme.com, if Bob's computer is set up to use the .100 addresses DNS, the request would go over to the DNS server. And now it's up to this DNS server to go ahead and respond back to Bob. Now, if this DNS server doesn't know what the IP address is behind acme.com, then this DNS server can be configured to act as a forwarder, which then it will go ahead and make a request out to an external or another DNS server to make that request. So in this example, let's imagine that the DNS server at 8888, Google's DNS server, knows the IP address of acme.com. It would simply then respond back. So the response comes back to the DNS server that made the request. And in that response, it would say, oh yeah, to get to acme.com, it's 23.1.2.3. And then the internal DNS server would feed that information back to Bob. So all Bob knows is that behind the scenes, his computer made a request, got a response, and now Bob can establish a session out to 23.1.2.3. Now, to also save time and energy with domain name system, there's also caches that are involved. So this DNS server that made the request, once it got the response back, it's going to cache that information for a period of time. And that way, if somebody else makes a request for that same DNS name, if it's in the cache, the server can go ahead and respond back to the client without making another request on its own. And in similar fashion over here on Bob's computer, when Bob gets the response back about the IP address associated with acme.com, Bob's local computer could also cache that information. And the question may come up, why? Why does it cache? Well, the benefit, my friend, is simple, is that the client, if it's cached, doesn't have to make another request and waste additional packets and time if it already has learned once what that IP address is and can store that locally in its own memory. So in our objective for you and I in this nugget, we've taken a look at a high-level overview of our purpose of DNS, and that is to resolve names into IP addresses. And it's not just used for internet resources. Also in an Active Directory environment, when a computer comes up and needs to authenticate in Active Directory, it's going to be using DNS to find, for example, a domain controller that can provide that authentication. So we've taken a fairly high-level look at the purpose of DNS, and we've also taken a look at a few of the methods that are used as part of DNS, including the request and the caching that goes on with DNS. And what I'd love to do right now is walk you through a short demo to reinforce this and also take the opportunity to introduce you to the hands-on lab environment that allows you, my friend, the opportunity to practice and reinforce all of the skills that you are learning as we go through and enjoy these nuggets together. So there's 3 basic steps of getting the most out of the labs. Number 1 is to use the lab. So you're logged on to cbtnuggets.com. You go to this video or any other videos that have a lab associated with them in this course. And over on the right-hand side, there's a link that launches the virtual lab environment. And the question may come up, okay, exactly what should we practice? And what I would recommend you do is go ahead and practice exactly those things that we've done together in this nugget. And that way, it'll reinforce and enhance the learning that you are doing as part of this course. So we've given it a minute to initialize and bring up the lab environment for us. And another tip I'd like to share with you is that if you want to save just a minute or two every time you're doing labs, in the nugget, when I start doing a demonstration, you could pause it just for a moment, launch the lab environment, and then by the time that we've enjoyed finishing our nugget together, then if you want to go back and practice using the lab, it'll have already been up and started for a few minutes and all initialized, ready to go. So in this nugget, I've got a single virtual machine, and it is this guy right here. It's called DC-Nug. And if there were multiple virtual machines, which there will be as part of our course as we proceed on, the additional virtual machines will be listed right here. So you simply select or click on the virtual machine that you want the interface for so you can work with it. Also, another handy feature that's showing the password right here, for example, for administrator. And if you don't want to type that in, you can put the cursor right here in the password field. You can click on the little icon for clipboard, and it will put that password into that space for you. So you can click on the clipboard right here, and then click on the arrow to simply log on as administrator without having to manually type the password. So we'll go ahead and do that now. I'll go ahead and make sure the mouse is here in the password field. We'll click on the clipboard next to password, which pastes that password in for us. We can click on the little eyeball just to verify that it is the password, and click on the arrow to log on. And what I just did was I just tore down that VM and brought up a new one because I wanted this guy to be named DNS-Nug. So I restarted a virtual machine with DNS-Nug as the VM we're going to use in this lab. And then to hide this control panel over here, you just click on this pin icon, and what it'll do, it'll push it over to the right. So I'll go ahead and do that now. And then you can also resize the browser it's in so that you can see the lab environment in the way that's comfortable for you. So to demonstrate the DNS functionality, let's go ahead and bring up PowerShell. I'm going to click on the bottom left-hand corner on the Windows icon. And then there's a tile for PowerShell right here. So we'll click on Windows PowerShell. And if you're not on a Windows server and you just want to use a DOS prompt or a command prompt, you can do that as well. And while I have this up, I'm going to right-click on this icon in the taskbar for PowerShell. And then from the menu, I'm going to select Pin to Taskbar. So it's just right there, easy for us to use if we ever need to launch it again. So here at the command line, if we wanted to verify, first of all, our IP information on this computer, which is an important part for networking, we can use the command ipconfig. And if you use a space /all and then press enter, it'll give us all the detailed information regarding IP configuration on this computer. In this case, we're looking at it from a client perspective. So the command is ipconfig /all. Here's our Ethernet 0 information. Here is the IPv4 address, which is 192.168.1.100. We are sitting at the Windows 2016 server. The default gateway is 192.168.1.1. And the DNS server that this device has been configured to use at this point is a Google DNS server at 8.8.8.8. Then below it has additional information regarding IPv6, which we'll save for another discussion. So we know this device, this Windows 2016 system, has a DNS server configured for it to use. One of the questions that we could ask this system is, what have you learned and cached as far as DNS entries? And to discover that, we can use the command ipconfig. So we'll hit the up arrow key, but instead of using the option of all, we'll use the option of display DNS, and we'll press enter. Now, at the moment, there are no current entries in this cache on this system. However, there's a lot of stuff going on all the time with Windows and connecting to other systems. So it is very likely when you and I do this command and look at the cache, there will be information there on a computer that's making multiple calls and looking at things on the internet. For example, if we did a ping out to www.google.com and pressed enter, in the background, it had to do name resolution. So that name resolution, it resolved google.com to this IP address of 216.58.194.36. And then it proceeded to use the ping utility to verify connectivity to that IP address with 4 pings. So now if we hit the up arrow key a couple times, and we did an ipconfig /display DNS and pressed enter, here it's showing us that in the cache For this computer, it now knows that google.com can be reached at this IP address. And if we wanted to remove that information, get rid of it, we wanted to flush the cache, we could hit the up arrow key again, and with ipconfig, instead of using the option of ipconfig/display DNS, we could use the option of flush DNS. So we'll type that in and press enter, and that flushed or removed the entries in that cache. So if we hit the up arrow key a couple times and do the display DNS once again, now it's empty. And this is an example of a device that's acting only as a client of DNS. So in this nugget, we've taken a look at the purpose of DNS, and that is primarily to resolve or to figure out the associated IP address behind a name. Secondly, we went through the methods of how it works, with a client making a request and getting a response back from a DNS server. And third, we did a demonstration in the lab environment as a client that's using DNS as a service. Now, the next trick that we get to do is we're going to configure our Windows 2016 server as a DNS server. And we'll do that, my friend, in our very next nugget. Meanwhile, I'd love for you to practice with this lab that we've just done by logging into cbtnuggets.com, going to this video, clicking on the link for the lab, opening up PowerShell, and practicing with ipconfig, including the options of /all, /display DNS, and /flush DNS. And when you're done with that hands-on practice, in the next nugget, we'll add the DNS server role to our Windows 2016 server. So have some fun with the labs. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.